Chapter 1 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimké. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1 Ancestry and Antecedents. Charles Sumner was born in the West End of Boston, January 6, 1811. The founder of the American branch of the family, William Sumner, emigrated from England with his wife Mary and 3 sons about the year 1635 and settled in Dorchester in the colony of Massachusetts Bay. There and in Milton, the Sumners, during the 17th and 18th centuries, made farming pay, turning out of the stony soil golden crops in more senses than one. For while they increased their acres and builded new barns, they also laid up for their children goodly shares of virtue and intelligence. These goodly shares in the family bank of character and ability yielded every now and then an extra dividend in the shape of a Sumner of unusual force and distinction in society and the state. One of these extra dividends upon the moral capital of the family was Job Sumner, the grandfather of our hero. A rather remarkable man with a somewhat remarkable career was Job Sumner. He was a freshman at Harvard University when the Battle of Lexington was fought. The emergency, he perceived, demanded soldiers, not scholars then, and boy though he was, and thirsting for knowledge, he promptly determined to meet the demand of the hour by making himself into a soldier. Accordingly, a few weeks later, the young collegian forsook his studies and joined the American army at Cambridge, subsequently commanded by Washington. That Job Sumner had in him the stuff of which soldiers are made is shown by the fact of his entering the Continental service as an ensign and of his being mustered out as a major at the close of the War for Independence. Besides his military capacity, Major Sumner was also a man of affairs, and attained under the Confederation distinction as a civilian. In 1785, Congress entrusted him with a commission to adjust the accounts between the Confederation and Georgia. This business carried him south, where he resided during the last years of his life. These last years were spent by him, therefore, in the very heart of the slave system. The precise attitude of the man during this time toward the slave system cannot now be positively known, but that it was not a hostile one may reasonably be inferred from his long residence in Georgia and from his undoubted popularity in the aristocratic circles there, a thing quite unlikely to occur were he at all suspected of being opposed to slavery. Indeed, this popularity of the commissioner was of so marked a character that there ran a tradition that shortly before his death he was the recipient of a very large vote in the legislature for the governorship of the state. But whether this last is fact or fancy, so much may be set down as morally certain that Major Sumner's status in Georgia was the status of a friend of the master, not of the slave. He was not a man to look on the darker side of life in general, or of Southern life in particular. He had no touch of the Puritan in his constitution, but was of a gay and social temper, a lover of music and hunting songs, with a strain of the cavalier instead in his disposition. Upon such an one the barbarism of slavery was not likely to produce any strong impression. On the contrary, upon him the power, the leisure, the outdoor sports, the stately manners, the lordly hospitality, and the baronial splendor of the masters were calculated to exert an attraction amounting almost to fascination. All this magnificence was quite enough to dazzle and blind the moral vision of a mere man of the world, as was Major Sumner, to the other and uglier aspects of the question, to those social enormities which lay at the center of the slave system, and which made of it the sum of all villainies. Job Sumner never lost his thirst for knowledge. He was a lifelong lover of good books and a reader of them also. His appetite for learning reappeared in his son, and drank deep of the Pyrean spring in the scholarship of his illustrious grandson. Eloquence and manners were the two principal points which he set up in the education of his heir. They, with wisdom and the languages, seemed to him to be the grand pillars of all great objects and great men. If he failed in respect of their acquirements in his own life, he meant to succeed, if possible, in respect of them in the life of his child. The ambition of the father for excellence and distinction descended with the paternal estate to the son Charles Pinckney, whose name bears witness to the Southern slant of Job Sumner's early political inclination and sympathy. The father of Charles Sumner was of another mold than the grandfather. Life did not run merrily with him. He was in truth a reversion to the stern and somber type of the Puritan. The love of books, the scholarly tastes, the ambition for excellence and distinction he inherited from Major Sumner, and he bettered his inheritance. Fortune favored the son in this regard, as it did not favor the father. For Charles Pinckney Sumner received the education of a gentleman. He graduated from Harvard College in the class of 1796. Subsequently, he studied law and began its practice in the office of Josiah Quincy in Boston about 1799. But although a learned lawyer, he did not succeed in building up a lucrative business. His practice was in fact quite insignificant, altogether inadequate to the support and education of an increasing family. For notwithstanding the gloomy and unsocial character of the young attorney, he was evidently of the general opinion of mankind that it is not well for man to live alone, and so, in pursuance of this sentiment, he wooed Relief Jacob of Hanover, and wedded her April 25, 1810. She supplemented the deficiencies of the husband in all respects where these, with another sort of wife, might have affected disastrously the happiness of the family. She was a woman of sterling good sense, of splendid physical health, of an equable and cheerful temper. She made a model mother to the children of Charles Pinckney Sumner. Children came promptly to the pair. 9 months after their marriage, the young wife was delivered of twins, a boy and a girl. The boy was he who is the subject of this book. At the end of 10 years, there was a family of 4 boys and 2 girls. With an increasing family of children, there fell upon their breadwinner increasing cares. The wherewithal to fill so many mouths, both of the mind and of the body, became a problem doubtless of no little perplexity and difficulty to the father. His practice of the law proving unequal to the exigency, Mr. Sumner abandoned it in 1819, after the arrival of the 5th mouth, and before the advent of the 6th, and accepted the office of a deputy sheriff for Suffolk County, from which he derived an income of something less than $1,000 a year. Now, small as is this amount, it was certain, and in all matters touching the support of a poor man's family, a bird in hand is worth 2 in the bush. The condition of the Sumner family was distinctly bettered by this change. The 2 ends began then to meet much more easily and comfortably, thanks always to the housewifely management and thrift of the mother. The tide of fortune, which had made so feeble a beginning for the Sumner family, flooded in 1825 when the ex-attorney at law received the appointment of high sheriff for Suffolk County. There was from that time a decided access of the circulating medium in that household. Mr. Sumner's annual income from this source more than doubled, and during some years more than trebled the amount of the receipts from the office of deputy sheriff. The contracted circumstances of the family gave place to ampler living and prospects. Directly after his promotion to the shrievalty, Mr. Sumner moved his family from the small frame house where 8 of his 9 children were born, and which was then standing on the southeast corner of what today are known as Revere and Irving streets, then May and Butolph, to the more commodious dwelling, number 63 Hancock Street, as the numbers now run. 5 years later, in 1830, Mr. Sumner's improved circumstances enabled him to purchase number 20 on the same street as a homestead, which was so occupied thereafter until the death of his widow in 1866. The augmented resources of the father bore other fruits, indicative of his increased official and social importance in the city. Twice a year he entertained at dinner the judges, members of the bar, and other distinguished gentlemen. But perhaps the most considerable result which the favorable turn in the father's affairs produced was the sending to Harvard of his eldest son, for that event exercised no slight influence in the elevation of the Sumner name and character to the national regard and renown to which they subsequently attained in the life and labors of that self-same eldest son. Mr. Sumner occupied the post of sheriff for a period of nearly 14 years, until, in fact, within 2 weeks of his death on April 24, 1839, the Sumner courage, independence, and devotion to duty, which developed to such magnificent proportion in the son, the father possessed to a marked degree. Where duty called him, no danger, however stern, was able to deter him from appearing. This trait of the man found striking illustration in 1837, when, on the occasion of a riot in Broad Street, he read amid a shower of missiles the riot act to the rioters. At the time of the broadcloth mob which drew Garrison through the streets of Boston, his courage and devotion to duty were put to the severest test in the strenuous resistance which he, as sheriff, offered to that pro-slavery mob of gentlemen of property and standing in the community. But not once did he flinch in that emergency, but stood stoutly for law and order on that memorable October afternoon in 1835, throwing himself and his deputies intrepidly between the murderous rioters and their object, and earning thereby the publicly expressed thanks of the great abolitionists whom he so bravely protected. An incident in the summer of 1836 evinced the manly stuff of which his independence was made. There had been an attempt to return 2 female fugitive slaves under the Act of 1793 in the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. On account of some technical defect in the proceedings, Chief Justice Shaw was of opinion that there was not sufficient authority to hold the women, and so remarked in a judicial aside, which being caught by Samuel E. Sewell, who was acting as counselor for the fugitives, was quickly communicated by him to their friends, of which there were not a few in the courtroom at the moment. Whereupon the women were suddenly spirited out of the room and the clutches of the slave-catchers. Of course the baffled slave-catchers were enraged. So also were their sympathizers in Boston. Such a miscarriage of pro-slavery justice in 1836 was a rank offense in the nostrils of those gentlemen of property and standing who not 1 year before had overturned law and order in the city for the sake of putting abolition down. They were now, however, terribly scandalized by the rampant lawlessness of the 2 wretched women and their friends in evading the execution of a statute on which depended the peace and stability of the Union. Great failures, or little ones for that matter, require a scapegoat, a victim of some kind on whose head all blame for them may be laid. Sheriff Sumner was in this case selected as the victim, and on his head was charged the responsibility for the escape. Had he not absented himself at the time from the particular room in the court-house where the fugitives were under examination, had he provided an adequate force in anticipation of a rescue, well, the dignity of the law would have been sustained and the property of the dear South faithfully returned under the Constitution. He was, besides, accused of having expressed to Samuel E. Sewell sympathy with the women, to which he thus boldly replied, "Whether I addressed Mr. Sewell, as it is said, I cannot tell. But I should be ashamed of myself if I did not wish that every person claimed as a slave might be proved to be a free man, which is the purport of the words attributed to me." And again, at another time, he wrote, "It seems to me as if there were some persons in Boston who would have been gratified to see those women, after being liberated from one unlawful detention, seized in the courthouse in the presence of the judge, and confined till proof could be sent for to Baltimore, and from thence to be sent to Boston to make them slaves. I hope the walls of a Massachusetts courthouse will never witness such a spectacle." The pro-slavery tide of the city ran so strongly against the sheriff in consequence of his alleged responsibility for the escape of the 2 women, that Mr. Sumner tendered to Edward Everett, who was then governor of the state, the resignation of his office. But it is to the credit of the eloquent dough-faced executive that he did not sacrifice the brave old man to the pro-slavery clamor of his constituents. The love of liberty of Charles Sumner's father cropped out prominently in this episode of the slave women, but more than 40 years before, when he was a senior at Harvard College, it cropped out in a poem no less distinctly. No sanctioned slavery Afric's sons degrade, but equal rights shall equal earth pervade, sang the young disciple of democracy. He was indeed thoroughly anti-slavery, seasoned, so to speak, in the grain and fiber of him with a love of freedom and equality. At a time when the prejudice against color was universal and most barbarous and atrocious, he seemed singularly devoid of all taint of its inhumanity. To the colored people whom he met on the streets of the city, as it was with the white people, he was no respecter of persons, returning salutation for salutation in his stiff, ceremonious manner. He opposed the spirit of caste, was entirely willing to occupy a seat on the bench by the side of a Negro judge, was opposed to the exclusion of colored children from the public schools of the city, also to the statutory prohibition of the intermarriage of the blacks and the whites. He was particularly pronounced against the lawless demonstrations in the North toward the abolition movement. He was, in fine, a man who was immovably anchored to liberty, to law and order, and as early as 1820 he entertained startlingly bold views in regard to the conflict between freedom and slavery in the Union. "Our children's heads," he was once heard to say, "will some day be broken on a cannon ball on this question." Little dreamed he at the time that the head of his 9-year-old boy would be broken among the first of the heads of the then rising generation, which he foresaw were destined to so tragic a fate. His puritanic abhorrence of vice led him as early as 1830 to take public and advanced ground in favor of temperance and for the divorce of the state from the rum power. During his student years at Harvard, he eagerly anticipated the time when feudal war shall cease through every clime. Take what we already know of him in connection with the laboriousness and thoroughness with which he pursued knowledge, and does it not seem that Charles Pinckney Sumner was designed by nature for a part greater than the one played by him in society and the state? The design was defeated by some defect of character or environment, or possibly of both, but nature in this instance was but temporarily balked of her purpose, for what was wanting in the sire she mixed with no niggard hand into the mental and moral qualities of the son, who bore not the whole, but a part only of the father's name, as if to mark a difference which controls character and destiny. Charles's childhood was not unlike that of the 100 other boys of his class in Boston during the same period. He first attended a private school, and afterward the famous Latin school of the city, where he was not especially distinguished above his mates as an apt scholar. Indeed, his average standing was perhaps not much, if any, above mediocrity during the 5 years of his attendance upon this school. He was weak in mathematics, but strong in the Latin and Greek classics, particularly in the former, which is evinced by the number of prizes which he won for translations from that language into English in the years 1824 and 1826. If he was not among the first of his class in the prescribed studies, he was considerably in advance of the foremost in the knowledge which comes from general reading, especially in the departments of history and English literature. His appetite in respect of these subjects was precocious and enormous. Like Edmund Burke, he had his furor historicus, which comprehended the study of geography as well. This and his passion for belles lettres lasted him through life. But unlike Burke, he took not to mathematical subjects, nor to those of logic or metaphysics, which seemed to indicate thus early a lack of versatility and symmetry of faculties. His knowledge of books in general, and of history in particular, was the wonder of his mates, the watershed of his mind, so to speak, if wanting in the direction of the exact sciences and of speculative studies, was of amplitudinous proportions toward the quarter where lie the humanities. Metaphorically, the winds were always blowing, and the floods ever descending along this slant into his mind. The boy proved the father of the man in this regard, and in other regards as well. Quite early he developed a remarkable capacity for sustained labor along lines of his own choosing. If he attacked a book of history, he went at it with an earnestness and a thoroughness which left no page unappropriated, no place unlocated on the map spread out before him. Even when a mere slip of a boy, he did nothing by halves. The pursuit of knowledge was even then a delight, and to be thorough a necessity of his nature. There was nothing intermittent and gusty in his energy and industry. Constancy was an attribute of the boy as it was later of the man. In truth, this precocious capacity for sustained labor, together with the thoroughness and constancy with which the boy pursued a given subject, were, as we look back over those early years, nor more nor less than the obscure dawn of the man's future noon. The boy possessed a natural disinclination to the games of childhood. There was an infinite amount of study in him, but precious little sport. This was at once his strength and his weakness, for while it served to place him en rapport with great men and their ideas and deeds, it operated also to exclude him too much and too early from the real, the actual, in our workaday world. In this isolated state, knowledge from 100 sources in the world of letters streamed into his mind, but altogether too little found its way there directly from that vast reservoir of all knowledge, life itself. His playfellows he sought in the realm of fancy and genius. With them he found himself in touch. This idiosyncrasy of the boy left its limitations upon the man. The boy had no capacity for play, the man none for humor. A certain versatility and spontaneity of thought and feeling, accordingly, he always lacked, and lacking them he failed to reach the highest rank in eloquence, either popular or parliamentary. At the age of 15 he entered Harvard College. This was not, however, the original object of his desire, which was for a military education. This wish of the boy was seconded by his father, who endeavored to find an opening for him into the National Academy at West Point. The ill success of these endeavors, together with the favorable turn which the affairs of Mr. Sumner took through his appointment to the Suffolk Shrievalty, probably determined him to give Charles a liberal education, and so, of course, he was sent to the college at Cambridge. Here the youth grew in mental stature, but away from the curriculum standard and toward the innate forces and biases of his mind. His inaptitude for metaphysical studies was palpable, and in mathematics he was a flat failure. For himself, and as regards any comprehension of those subjects, they were mathematics piled on mathematics, metaphysics murdered and mangled, during the entire 4 years of the course. To this circumstance was undoubtedly due the fact that in rank he stood well down toward the middle of his class. In a class of 48 he was not among the 16 who were elected into the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Notwithstanding this failure of young Sumner to take high rank in his class, his industry along lines of general knowledge was extraordinary. The qualities which we have already noted as belonging to him, his capacity for sustained labor, his thoroughness and constancy, as also his indisposition to mingle with his mates in their sports and pastimes, received during these years the most emphatic demonstration and development. His joy was in exploring a library, or delving into works of history and general literature. In his chosen field he was probably without a peer among his fellows. His indefatigable and prodigious industry made marvel for youths not of his class. Wendell Phillips, who was in the class just below him, used to recall how, when he and others of the students were wont to return from Boston in the small hours of the morning, and to make those hours jocund with song and merriment, they would see the solitary light burning in Sumner's window, and would know by that sign that the young scholar was still poring indefatigably over his books. In his senior year he won the second Bodewin prize of $30, taking for his theme the present character of the inhabitants of New England, as resulting from the civil, literary, and religious institutions of the first settlers, in whose composition his wide reading must have stood him in good stead. Other qualities than those already remarked upon began during his 4 years at Harvard to disclose themselves saliently in his fast-forming character. One of these was a constitutional inability to abandon a position when once it was taken. The elements were so mingled in him of Saxon phlegm and Puritan seriousness as to interpose an almost insurmountable barrier to changes of opinion. One of his classmates recorded years afterward that Sumner was not in the habit of changing his opinions or purposes. He adhered to them as long as he could. If he had an idea that A and B stood the highest of any in the class, nothing could change his opinion except their having the third or fourth part at the commencement. There went along with this mental immovability or inertia a certain dogmatism and finality of action. He was thus strongly held to an original bent or belief. Where, metaphorically, he sat down, it was safe to say that there he would ever afterward be found. That enlargement of the ego which seems to be an indispensable ingredient in the constitution of powerful personalities, kept pace from this period with the growth of the youth. Whatever else our young collegian may have lacked from the hand of nature, he was assuredly not deficient in self-confidence and self-esteem. Humility was not one of his cardinal virtues. On the contrary, an unconcealed pride of self and consciousness of power formed the basis of his character. Here, in a sense, in later years, resided the man's center of gravity. There are other characteristics which were found in the youth, which later were found in the man. There was no mystery as to how he should be classified. He was always and distinctly of the vertebrated breed of men. Man's crowning quality he possessed beyond the ordinary lot, ability to stand mentally and morally erect and alone. Strong was the Saxon passion for personal liberty in his veins. While a student, he dared to disregard a college regulation which infringed his individual right to determine the exact color of his waistcoat. He was admonished that a buff-colored waistcoat was not white, but Sumner contended that it was white, or nearly enough so to comply with the rule. His insistence and persistence, it is said, finally carried the point, and he continued to wear the waistcoat of his choice, the admonitions to the contrary notwithstanding. It was a case of color blindness with a vengeance. Sumner refused then to distinguish buff from white, as he refused subsequently to distinguish black from the self-same hue. His will, even then, had the character of adamant. A resolution once formed by him was, humanly speaking, as sure of execution as that day would follow night. If he appointed a certain evening to go into Boston, a classmate records he would go even in a violent snowstorm. And to go into Boston from Harvard Square in those days under the circumstances and before the age of horse cars on one's own two legs was an altogether formidable achievement. Between a fixed purpose and its end, he allowed no difficulties to daunt or deter him. The youth's will was dictator. If it said, do this, it was done. Go there, there he went. This received signal illustration the year after his graduation, when he devoted himself to making up his deficiencies in a branch of knowledge for which he had literally no taste or talent. But by sheer strength of will he compelled himself to wrestle with the roots of algebra and the problems of geometry until, Jacob-like, he had wrested from them the blessing which comes from earnest struggle and self-sacrifice. He never became proficient in either, but the trial added without doubt to the muscularity of his faculties, moral and intellectual. Although impatient of the narrowness and intolerance of the Puritans, he was nevertheless a true son of them in respect of the supremacy of the moral sense. Their severe, uncompromising standard in matters of morality was his own. Right, duty, conscience were, from childhood with him, not mere fine words, but supreme realities. They could hardly be otherwise in the case of any child of Sheriff Sumner. We are struck with other traits in studying the youth and early manhood of Charles Sumner, and they are his sociability and his sympathy. As a youth he was full of geniality, most companionable, notwithstanding his sedentary habits and devotion to books. He made friends, many and lasting were his friendships. He gave himself the best in him in large and overflowing helpfulness. Whether the object was a dying teacher or a struggling scholar, it made no difference. There gushed for all alike fullness and richness of friendly service. Ever ready he was to thrust his neck under some new yoke, to offer his back to some fresh burden, for friendship's sake. The possessor of sympathies at once sensitive and virile must needs exercise them as the seller of perfumes must needs scatter as he goes the fragrance of his wares. These traits, when coupled with the force of conscience which was strong within him, pointed with no uncertainty to a life of usefulness, if not to a career of greatness. Sumner was fortunate in his environment. The intellectual life of Boston 60 years ago was full of those notabilities and energies of the pulpit, the bar, politics, and scholarship which have so often illustrated the city. Webster, then in the zenith of his fame and genius as statesman, orator, and jurist, was a familiar figure on its streets, a familiar voice in its courts and on its platforms. Several times had Sumner heard him in the old town, and once, indeed, the great man, as the president of the Boston Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, had taken the young scholar by the hand and assured him that the public held a pledge of him. This was on the occasion of an essay of Sumner's on commerce, taking the prize of that society on the evening of April 1st, 1831. There were, besides, in politics, such leaders as John Quincy Adams and Harrison Gray Otis at the bar, such lights as Rufus Choate and Franklin Dexter in the pulpit, such orators as John Pierpont and Lyman Beecher, while that remarkable man, Josiah Quincy, was at the head of the scholarship of the old town as the president of the famous seat of learning just across the river. The atmosphere was full of literary and professional stimulus and ferment, charged, so to speak, with those fine potencies and activities which generate in communities great ambitions and aspirations, which create irrepressible desires and strivings for excellence and distinction through the whole human lump. Thus equipped and amid conditions and circumstances so tonic, stood Charles Sumner with the skeleton key, hard work in his hand, and the magic word Excelsior on his lips, those two instruments which have unlocked to many a youth, high-born and low-born, the portal of power and the gate of glory. End of chapter 1.